Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Modern Overman. Okay, so for today's video, it's going to be another bit of a kind of slightly longer form, more opinionated video, and you'll see from the title that I wanted to talk about the maps of Hunt Showdown. You know, it's been just about a year since we had the relaunch of 1896. Before that, we had only three maps: Stillwater Bayou, Lawson Delta, and DeSalle. And then with the relaunch, we got Mammon's Gulch, but that was our only map for like the first month of the relaunch. And then we got Stillwater Bayou 30 or so days after that. And then we got Lawson Delta sometime after that as well. I don't remember exactly when. And then we only just recently got DeSalle about a year later, which is kind of interesting and insane if you think about it, because like they were very mum on when we were getting DeSalle returned to the game. I know they spoke on some other random socials that almost very little people knew about, and so, but that's another point. The point is now is that we have all four maps now in the game, and it's been, like I said, a year, but the game has been going, I mean, since 2018, really in early access, and I think the full launch was like really in 2020, kind of 2019, but mostly in 2020. So it's been about 5 years of the game fully running, and we only just now have four maps. And I think the biggest thing, and we'll get into that at the end of the video, is that, you know, there's been so much other quote-unquote content that Crytek has been focusing on that the maps aren't really that much of a priority for them. Obviously, it's like a huge important part and aspect of the game, you know, that centers around all of our gameplay on how the maps are. But we'll get into that. So I'm going to break down each map, kind of how I feel about all four of them. And then at the end, we'll kind of do some more speculation onto why the maps are important and why creating and taking the time to make a new map is also really important. And then we'll kind of have like a wish list of potential maps in the future. So why don't we go ahead and get into it. And before we do, don't forget to like and subscribe. And we'll see you at the end of the video. Okay, so Stillwater Bayou, obviously the very first map when the game launched in early access. It's definitely, you know, it has that OG feeling, especially when they re-released it. It was kind of like, it was very nice to see the original map, like, kind of in all its intended glory, you know, probably like what max settings should have been like on PC as far as like the console version is concerned. And obviously it has a really great visual identity to it. But it is the classic map, right? And so it obviously has flaws that they try to improve upon with later maps. But it still has some really great compounds and really great ways to get across. But, you know, one of the first things I want to talk about is sort of its, you know, everybody loved to use this word verticality when Mammon's Gulch was coming out. Lawson Delta is pretty flat, and its compounds are relatively simple. You know, so like on the east side of the map, when you have places like Healing Church Waters and Stillwater Bend and Alice Farm and Chapel, those are really some big open areas and, you know, big chunks of land. And so it makes it kind of not difficult to traverse, but it's definitely more of a risk when you're traversing that to snipers and people who are sitting far back with rifles. And then you have the western side of the map with Blanchett Graves, a little bit of pitching and Lock Bay and Darrow. Definitely Elaine and Sons and Rayner's Mill and Lumber, where there's a lot more water. You know, obviously there's water down near Catfish Grove down in the corner and a little bit in Scupper Lake. But Blanchett Graves, that whole kind of surrounding area, is where you're going to have most of the water in the game. And so, like, using little traversable islands and, like, land bridges and everything like that, it's kind of not really, I mean, it's also exposed as well, and it doesn't give you that much cover. And so, overall, I think Stillwater Bayou probably has one of the least amount of, you know, like, visual covers, like, within, you know, all of the other maps. And it can be kind of, I don't know, I mean, there's definitely places to get cover and to hide, you know, but like it just doesn't have that much cover. As far as the compounds are concerned, you know, there are a few pretty good compounds. I really like playing in Stillwater. Stillwater Bend. I do like playing in, but its boss lair is only down below, which is kind of frustrating. Like I would like it to have, if a compound has a boss lair, I mean, like all compounds have boss lairs, but a compound's boss lair, I think, should be available both top and below. Um, like if you think about Healing Waters Church, which is where the footage is right now, there's the clear lower level, where you can fight, I think, pretty much all the bosses. And then you have this upper level here where you can fight the bosses as well. Although it's been a long time, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe it is only Spider and Assassin you can fight up here, but I can't remember exactly. But either way, it's nice to have a dual level boss fight. Similarly with Blanchard Graves is also like a nice area where it has like multiple boss rooms. It has like three boss rooms technically because it's got the grave site where bosses can be, and then it's got the actual chapel itself, which has a lower level and a higher level, which where you can fight the bosses in. Um, but I kind of want to pinpoint like compounds that I don't particularly care for. Cypress Huts, it's kind of meh. It's not very interesting. It's got a really small boss layer. Um, I feel like it's more cluttered than anything. That it doesn't really have complexity. It kind of sucks to fight in. And like going from the top level, of the boss layer and well, I guess like just being above the boss layer, it's kind of like fish in a barrel for a lot of people. If you're down in the boss layer, um, it's not a whole lot of fun. Devont Ranch is okay. Slaughterhouse is okay. Catfish, I feel like Catfish is definitely a little bit more dynamic for being a water level. I almost always have fun playing Catfish. It doesn't have the most amazing cover as far as like outside of the boss layer, like the little buildings and stuff, but it's still pretty fun. And it's a relatively large area. Healing Water Church I like. Pigeon Crematorium is undoubtedly one of the worst compounds in the game, in my opinion. You can have a fun fight outside, but there's not a whole lot of like building, to play around. There's like a little bit of cover, but it's all like pretty close to one another. And then when you're down below in the boss layer, not only can you just like hardly see, right, with all like the visual, clutter that's going on in your vision, but it's also like you can't hear what's going on up above you. You can barely hear like on that same level. It's just not a fun compound to play in at all. I very much don't like it. Stillwater Bend is a little bit better. It still has kind of the same issue. Like I'd rather not fight in the boss layer. I'd rather fight up above the ground. But there's lots of little areas to fight above ground, which is totally nice. Lock Bay Docks. It's a great compound, but if you can, if you get stuck in like a certain area, then it can not be fun. Sort of like that upper floor. Like with fire. People throw down or people coming at you from both sides. Like if you're not able to escape out of the window upstairs, you get in trouble. Especially if you have people sniping you from far out, you can really expose yourself. Alice Farm is an okay compound. I kind of keep it in the same, because they're right next to each other. Darrow and Alice Farm kind of have a similar vibe. Obviously, though, Darrow has the lower level. But I think they're okay compounds to fight in. Chapel Madonna Noir, I don't really like fighting there anymore. I used to like fighting there, but the lower level boss layer kind of has the same issue as before. Scupper Lake is fine. I think it's great to defend, not necessarily to attack. Just because like pushing in can be really challenging because like the areas that you have to get in are just like, I mean, you can really hold angles there and like trap up if you need to. We're gonna skip over Puerto Rico for a second. I'll come back to it. Raider Mill and Lumber, totally serviceable compound. I like that it has two big buildings, for its boss layer. I think it's a fun compound to fight in. Land and Sons Fish, also pretty fun. Terrible kind of to approach, because of how much water surrounds it. But overall, it's pretty fun. The issue is like if you're fighting and there's an extract really close by because of the corner, then it can be, yeah, it can not be fun. Port Rico though, I would say is probably my favorite
What?
compound. It's just like,
From where?
yeah, it's great. I think it's so
Okay.
I love the size of it,
Okay.
and it's I think the biggest compound like by like complexity is concerned on the map, and yeah, it's probably one of my favorites.
Really rough, dude. Like we gotta go
Okay,
there.
so Lawson Delta, it's definitely one of the
What was
better
the
maps
motivation
of the
for it to be?
game. I feel like it was a huge improvement coming off of Stillwater Bayou, with the variety of compounds and just like the overall complexity and like having, a certain level of verticality
And like
within
it's
the
fucking
compounds
disgusting
and
too.
like
Like
just
I
overall
hate
size of the compounds as well. I feel like is
fighting
is
assassins.
better
Like the
and
void
their attempt to be
giving a
more
bigger
dynamic
information in terms
with
of what type of
the
weapon I
actual
have or it
compounds as
costs,
far as like what you
then
can
that'll be
do
great,
and like
because like
yeah, I feel like it's just a much better map overall, way
like
less water,
the
which is
more
great.
information that you
There's
can
like
keep within
very
the map,
little
the better.
traversal over like big patches of water, which is really nice. Let's see, kind of, I want to take a look at some of my least favorite compounds. Bradley and Craven Brickworks, I'm not really fond of it. It kind of sucks to defend. Pushing in can be like kind of all right, but just overall, it kind of sucks to defend. Um, Sweet Bell Flower, I like, but at the same time, I don't know. Like it's just like I feel like there's a little bit too much going on there as far as like that big hallway. You can get kind of stuck on in fights in there, and having to like shoot across the buildings like where I'm at right now get in the game. It just like I don't know. It's not super fun, but again, it's like it's in my opinion, it's not really as bad as any of the other compounds on Stillwater. Um, you know, Goddard Docks, is kind of an okay compound to fight in, but not one of my favorites. But why don't we go ahead and talk about like some of my favorites actually? Like Fort Carmick, I feel like is a perfect compound. Same thing here with Lawson Station. They're really great. Like there's so much. I don't know. I like their size. I like the complexity to them, especially Fort Carmick. I mean, like you have
Okay,
two
where's
really,
Fort Carmick?
fairly big boss layers. I would say. I guess the second one isn't, too big with the one with the two iron doors that you have to lift up, but it's still I like
How
how
big
it's
do is?
multi-tiered. There's a lot of ups and downs. Verticality to it. Um,
Okay.
Nichols Prison, I would like to say, is a similar situation, but I don't think it is. I think it's just there are too many narrow corridors, and it's kind of a shotgun's paradise in many ways, which is kind of ironic because I like playing shotgun, but at the same time, like I mean, if you have a rifle, like, do you really want to push into that compound? No, you want to hang out and wait for people to come out, like, however, far away. Um, Golden Acres, I used to like quite a bit, but it's kind of like I'm not really fond of it anymore. Salter's Pork has a similar vibe to where, like, I used to like fighting on it quite a bit. Um, but more often than not, like, I don't know. I just get demolished being in there every time for some reason. There's something about like the way in which people can push in and like the little tiny spots where people can snipe you from something like that. I don't know. I'm just like not a really big fan of it that much anymore. Windy Run is great. I think it is a kind of a chaotic boss layer to fight in. It's just like having the ups and downs and like the ramps on either ends. It is similar to Salter's Pork, but it's not quite the same. And I feel like yeah, it's just a great compound. Arden Parish, I feel like is definitely one of the more complex compounds in Lawson Delta, just because of having the big hole in the wall on the what side is that? On the west side of the building, and then like having the tower to be able to climb up to the multiple different ladders you can go in through, the all of the different windows upstairs and being able to block off certain areas downstairs. I think it's a really great, probably like one of the more perfect compounds in the game, just overall. it's really fun, and like all the little surrounding area, like you have a wide look of your surrounding compounds and everything like that, so you can get a good look, like a kind of a sniper's view with a rifle. It's pretty great. And then if you need to play inside with shotguns, like it's not bad. And then like pushing it, if you have a rifle, it's not impossible either, because you can kind of you can get upstairs, or you can get on top of like one of the other buildings and shoot in. Like you can get kind of close with a rifle that doesn't make it impossible. And yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite compounds. Overall, I think the visual design since the relaunch has been great. Um, I don't want to say the novelty wore off after the redesign of Stillwater Bayou, but I do feel like they have a really similar visual and aesthetic design that, of course they're distinguishable by their compounds, but overall, like the identity between them is kind of lacking. What I said before about Lawson having less water, that is really nice. Especially when you're trying to go from like say Goddard Docks to Ma Battery, that's a lot easier than you would like if you're going from, Lane's Fish and Sun to Blanchard Graves, in Stillwater Bayou. But it is really similar. And I think that moving forward, that's something that we'll talk about in the other two maps as far as visual identity is concerned. Okay, DeSalle. Well, I'm obviously going to have some recency bias here, but I will just go out and say this is probably one of my favorite maps right now. Since its relaunch and re-release into the game, I really feel like they did vastly improve its visual identity. It obviously had the kind of more orange and amber hues separate than the other two previous maps in the game. It definitely feels like, even though this is supposed to be still in the bayou, like this is a more northern, like almost Texas. I guess that wouldn't be northern, right? That would be western kind of setting of a map. It definitely doesn't feel the same as the other two bosses, or sorry, not the other two bosses, the other two maps, and I think that's really great. I will say, however, what we'll talk about in a moment is like how long it took to release the game, or sorry, release the map. Um, I'm glad they took a long time, but I think their communication needed to be much better. When the relaunch came with 1896, it's kind of like understood that like, hey, these maps are gonna slowly come out, right? And the way that they handled DeSalle was, almost non-existent as far as like verbal communication went. They didn't do it on any official socials, right? They didn't, say like on a Twitch stream or on like one of the dev updates or anything like that. They didn't talk about DeSalle like at all. And people were like, "Where's DeSalle? Where's DeSalle?" This is something that I brought up quite a lot, and I know others did as well. It's just like we were feeling like the game was left incomplete. And I mean, it still feels that way, but like at least we have all four maps now. And, instead is what we would hear second or third hand from like Crytek partners. They're like, oh no, they've talked about it on like this other Chinese social media website, and like Crytek partners are talking about like, oh, they had to rescrap the whole entire map, and it's coming eventually. Don't worry, guys, it's coming in June, which it ended up coming in June of this year, 2025. But at the same time, it's like, why isn't Crytek coming out specifically to say this? That's really frustrating, and I feel like if they do that again, like we need to be holding them accountable to communication, like especially since we're coming from a time of them trying to be more open with communication. Them failing on this front and talking about like when the old map is coming back, I feel like is a big L for the community, and we need to be holding them more accountable. As far as like the actual map is concerned, though, I'm very happy it's returned. It was definitely one of my favorite maps to play on in the old version of the game. It just has so many like little great compounds. It's got the perfect balance of water and land. The way kind of the little rivers split off, I think it's great. I almost have no complaints over any compounds. I'm trying to think of compounds that I don't particularly like playing in. I don't really like playing in Darren's Shipyard, but you can still like because of the way that compound is set up, it's not great to defend, but it's also easy to get out, I feel like if you need to, easy to maneuver. I used to not really care for fighting in Pelican Island Prison, but it's not nearly as bad as say Nichols Prison on Stillwater, or I'm sorry, on Lawson Delta. I just feel like it's a much better layout. Even something like Forked River Fishery, with it being such a tiny compound, is still really fun because of like the nature of how tight it is. Um, yeah, I pretty much like playing at every compound in this map. I mean, it's just all really fun. I mean, King Snake Mine, which where I'm at right now, is probably one of the more challenging areas to defend and attack. Like all of your rifle battles, long range battles are going to be definitely outside the compound. I wouldn't want a rifle like where I'm situated in right now. Stanley Cole is just an overall like fun map. I mean, I have no complaints about any of the maps or any of the compounds rather in this map. I just feel like yeah, I just feel like it's a great map, and they put a lot of time and effort into making it look a lot better. Um, fighting in places like Upper DeSalle and Lower DeSalle, I do feel like that could be one compound, right? I feel like there's no reason for it to be stretched out over like a bridge and a river. It would be kind of nice if it was just like one bigger area, but I get it. That's kind of approaching speculation on what could come in a future map, which we'll get into towards the end of the video. Um, but yeah, I don't really have a whole lot of complaints about DeSalle. I'm very happy with it. They like I said, they did a great job in reworking it. It's got a very distinct visual identity from the previous two maps. It's definitely probably yeah, I mean, I would say my favorite right now. So, yeah, why don't we go ahead and get into Mammon's Gulch, and we have a lot to say on that. Okay, so Mammon's Gulch, where to start? I think the biggest thing that we'll start with was let's talk about visual identity. So, in the example that I have here, I have the dusk time of day, which is not as common as some of the other times of day, like your midday, morning, and like late afternoon times of day. But the visual style of Mammoth Gulch obviously is, it's set in Colorado and it has a not a Pacific Northwest, but a definitely more mountain state vibe, but also kind of like, typical Western, like Wild West type area. It has different types of trees and foliage. It's got obviously kind of mountains in the distance, and the north side of the map, it has that town that I think somebody said it's based off of Colorado Springs. I'm not entirely sure, but it definitely has that kind of more 19th century feel of a town, as far as like the identity, is concerned. Um, and I think one of the things that is holding Mammon's Gulch back is its sort of visual style. When the map first launched, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it because of how different it was. But then we had to play it for over a month, and you start to kind of get worn out by it a lot because it doesn't have very high contrasting colors. The greens and the browns kind of blend together quite a bit. Um, and it kind of feels like I don't want to say it feels like living in a desert, because I lived in the desert before and this is not that, but it doesn't have the variety in which you would hope it to have. Like there's not very thick forest. I mean, there is some forested areas in this map, but it's not very like thick forest. It's definitely more of like a a loose kind of mountainous valley, I guess you could call it, which is why they probably designed the map that way, to have it not have thick forest. The foliage is very sparse, and I think that lends to kind of a blandness being a little bit more overwhelming than the other two maps, or sorry, the other three maps, because there's just more greenery. And even with DeSalle, you like all the yellows and ambers and different kinds of greens there. um it's just prettier to look at, DeSalle, in my opinion, than Mammon's Gulch. I do like the overall aesthetic design of compounds and buildings, but it is overall the look of the map is kind of, it can be unappealing at times, which is like sad to say because they clearly put a lot of time and effort into making this. Um, I think I was just hoping for some like more like actual, maybe mountainous trails and valleys and some forested regions that we didn't get. As far as the compounds are concerned, I think my issue here is that there's too much metal. There's too much metal to walk around on, and therefore, like, it's you can't conceal your steps very well. Places like Machine Gorge is one of my least favorite compounds to play in. There's so much metal, and I would it would be nice. Like, I just don't like playing there. It's way too loud. It's kind of hard to hear other things going on over my own footsteps. La Plata Mine, I don't really care to play in. Um, the other ones are okay, but it would be, I don't know. It just, I don't think it's all that great, and it sucks because of how long they took to put this map together. But there's definitely some improvements that could be made. But I think is what we'll do. We'll kind of move into speculation on what maps I would like to see in the future, and yeah, overall improvements they could do to map design.
The smaller bounty? I don't know.
Okay, something that I want to talk about next are a potential wish list, rather, of new maps that Crytek could be working on. Well, not necessarily speculating on what they could be working on, but something that I would personally like to see. But before I go into that, I do want to talk about how long it takes them to work on a map. I do feel like it is obviously the largest undertaking that they have to do as a game developer or work on these maps. Obviously, from conception to actualization and release is quite the process. And I wouldn't like shun them at all for like taking their time to work on a map because it's obviously like the most complex part of the game. I feel like obviously there's all the other systems, but like the detail for the maps coming together really makes or breaks a game. And that's why I was a little bit more harsh on Mammon's Gulch, is because, like color palette aside, I do feel like that there are structural elements of that map. I didn't mention like having to go through the mines and under the mountains. We thought that like, oh, okay, this might be like really interesting. It's something that we kind of wanted before, like with King Snake Mine in DeSalle. Um, but the issue with that is that they kind of misled us in the run up to it and marketing of Mammon's Gulch, saying they're like, oh no, you'd be able to track people over the mountains. And so it was almost kind of like, if somebody had the bounty token and you could track their lightning going underneath the mountains and through the mines, you could be like, okay, well, we're going to go on top of them. We're going to go up and over the mountains to try and get ahead of them or to track them or something like that. But that wasn't the case. The fact is that like the mines take up a huge portion of the middle of the map, and it's just not very fun to play in. I mean, like I would never take a fight into the mines unless like I absolutely had to in that game. And so, and then in addition to that, one of my other complaints about it was how much metal flooring there is. Like you step on so much metal that it kind of ruins the experience of walking around, at least for me. And so taking that into consideration when it comes to making a map, obviously little things like that could have a huge impact on how people receive your game and receive that sort of gameplay loop on a map. And so, with that being said, I know it takes a long time to make these maps. And I'm sure that they already have ideas that they've been working on. We haven't seen any leaks, potential map ideas. The Colorado map, Mammoth Gulch, leaked maybe like 2 years before it actually released. Like a basic kind of layout and you know, uh, like early look at a top-down view of potential compounds and layouts and everything like that. And obviously, it changed, I'm sure, quite significantly from conception. But we kind of got the base look at it, and so we haven't had any leaks like that for a new map, and so we don't exactly know a potential of what they're working on. Um, I would like to think that they definitely take community feedback into consideration, but obviously, they're going to have the final say. They haven't asked or done any surveys about maps in quite a long time, if ever. People have been requesting, kind of going out of the bayou for a long time and into a more mountainous region, which that's probably the impetus to make something like Mammon's Gulch. But they haven't really specifically requested community feedback for like how we perceive Mammoth Gulch, but then also what we would like to see in the future. And so that's why I'm putting together this part of the video. So I have three main ideas. They don't necessarily go in any order, but I do think that they're going from most wanted to least wanted. And so I want to start with my first idea, which is a whaling town in somewhere like the northeast of the U.S., like somewhere like northern New England, maybe like not as far as like Newfoundland, in Canada. I guess Newfoundland is technically its own territory or country. Um, but somewhere like the tip of Maine or Nantucket or something like that. And I would love to see like, a large section of docks and whaling ships and other sailing boats down on some docks. Like it would be great to see some like hung up fish and whale carcasses. You could have a dry dock similar to what you have in DeSalle at well, I can't remember the name of the compound, but somebody can write down in the comments below what that is. But you could have like maybe several large dry docks and like a large dock and warehouse system down by the coast, and then you could have maybe like a small-ish town or city, but probably more of a town just to like keep it not overwhelmingly, tight. But although like that's something that I think a lot of players do want is like something like a city or a town. The example I think of is I believe it's to the north of Mammoth Gulch. There's that Clear City that I think somebody mentioned that it might be based off of Colorado Springs. I'm not suggesting something like that, but something like a little town, maybe up on a hill or something like that. Maybe you could separate a lower downtown closer to the docks and then like a higher uptown that is up on a hill, a little bit situated away, maybe some nicer houses. You could have a forested region on the edge. You could have a nice big church and a bank. So similar to DeSalle. You'd obviously there'd be some crossover. There's only so many different things you can do. From that time period. The end of that century. But yeah, something like a whaling town I think would be really cool. You could have it just be like just mucky and nasty. You might have some new AI, like maybe you could lean into a kind of more Cthulhu mythos type thing where you have fishmen or something like that, like Dagon or something. It would be weird to have Rotjaw on that map, but maybe there's like I don't know. It would also be weird to see Hellborn, but they introduced Hellborn with Mammoth's Gulch, and so they could introduce a new type of AI. Maybe you have something like a special meathead, which is kind of funny because Butcher is already a special meathead. But you could add like a extra large albino meathead, and he's kind of like this white whale or something like that, and he's like would be by the water mostly, but maybe he could go out into town, and then who knows, maybe you might be able to add in some like headless horseman lore or something like that, like kind of upstate New York sort of thing. I don't know, something like that. I really feel leans into the aesthetic and horror elements of Hunt Showdown that I think would be really cool. Okay, so for the next idea I had was something like a Pacific Northwest trading outpost, maybe like a fur trading outpost, because that was really big at that time. A little bit beforehand, it was more popular, but it was still kind of going on around then. In those sort of like lower Canadian territories and like the Oregon territory. I guess like this is technically after the Oregon territory was a thing, but and before people jump on it and say that like, oh, we already have something Pacific Northwest with Mammoth Gulch, that is not Pacific Northwest. Just to set the record straight, Colorado is a mountain state. The Pacific Northwest includes parts of Northern California, parts of Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and a little bit of Montana. Um, Not Colorado, just so you guys know. But with that said, and that's just in the United States, but something like British Columbia, and I can't remember the other province that's just east of British Columbia. It might be the Yukon, but that also might be north. Somebody from Canada, listen, the Canadians. Why don't you go ahead and tell me where your states and provinces are located? Because I have no idea. I'm American. Um, I wouldn't go as far as somewhere like Alaska, but I think having something like a lot more kind of wet
Um,
forested areas would be really interesting. You already have sort of the assets with Mammoth Gulch and those type of mountainous trees, those type of fir trees, but have it to where like I don't know. There's maybe a lake. Maybe there is a trading outpost, a fort, something like a native village or something like that. It might be hard. I mean, you could have maybe a fewer smaller settlements up there. I don't know exactly how you would justify it, but I think it would be a really interesting setting for this game, and maybe you could lean into something like the lore of like Wendigos, although I do think that is maybe north or northeastern continental. But either way, you could have something like that. Have something like a Wendigo boss or Wendigo um, wild target, something where you can kind of lean into the horror of that area, like the folklore of that area, and it would maybe be a little bit less industrialized, and I think that's fine. Maybe you have like one logging mill or something like that. Now, granted, this is like slightly down the totem pole of what I would want, but I still think it would be really interesting. You could justify the rain a little bit more, coming from Thunder Shower. And don't worry, we're going to be doing a separate video on the wild card conditions, as they at least used to be called. But yeah, I don't know. I think that would be really interesting, especially being from that area. I think would be really cool to see. Again, you could justify having more Native American skins and more mountaineers, fur traders, that sort of thing. Maybe you have some giant like beaver dam in a river or something like that, and like you have to fight over that. Maybe there's little tunnels or something. You could have some more gold and silver mining. Um, Something like that I think would be really interesting. It would be kind of smaller scale than the industrial stuff that we see on some of the other maps. But either way, I think the game could really benefit from a visual change up and some more dynamic stuff. Not to say that it would lose its identity. They could still really do something that would lean into the identity of Hunt Showdown, but seeing something like that would be cool. And then, something that I haven't mentioned yet, but something like you could add snow as well for a wild card condition. Again, we'll get into that as well. I think that would really work well in something like a Pacific Northwest, like lower Western Canada. Um, yeah, I think that would be really cool to see. Okay, so the last suggestion that I have here is something like a, American Southwest sort of desert town, maybe canyon or something like that. That it would definitely change up I don't want to say it would change up the aesthetics of the game, but something like a much more dry climate, I think would be really cool to see. You could sort of I don't want to say you'd theme it around the OK Corral and Wyatt Earp or something like that, but you could lean into more of the kind of like American Western movies, where it is actually um, you have Mexican standoffs, you have stuff like that. I think it would be really cool. You could, as far as the environment is concerned, you could have like a big canyon, that is like a kind of a sniper spot. You could have a little oasis where somebody has a little tiny town, and then maybe you have like a bigger town that kind of maybe looks a little bit more like Upper DeSalle. I think you could have a very similar color palette to DeSalle, because it would be drier, it'd be a little bit more, I don't want to say mountainous, but rocky. You could have a big flowing river. Maybe you have a lake somewhere, but probably not. Somewhere like down in the southwest. I mean, I'm sure there are lakes down there. I've never been. But you could have pueblos. Maybe you could have. I don't exactly know where they are. Actually, I think they're in somewhere in Colorado. But you have uh, those. They're not houses, but they're living areas like built in the side of these canyons, like in the mountains. I think that would be really cool to have something like that. Have a shootout there. I think would be really cool. Um, this is definitely my least developed idea, but maybe you have train tracks going, along a certain way, and so there's like little outposts along the way. I don't exactly know like what would make a good boss lair or boss compound or like specific new AI. Having something like uh, almost like the Alamo, like on the borders of I can't, yeah, the Alamo is in Texas, and so having something like that, I think would be really cool. You could have like a big prison, like maybe a big open air prison, something like that. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I think something like that would be really interesting. Obviously, it would, as I mentioned, it would change the color palette quite dramatically. But I mean, there are things like flash floods down in the American Southwest. So thunder shower would fit right at home. I don't know how much snow gets down there. I do know that it gets cold in the wintertime, but not as cold as the northern parts of the U.S. Yeah, I don't know. I think that would be really interesting. I don't know what kind of new mobs or AI you could introduce, but I just think it would be an interesting idea, and I think people um, would warm up to something like that. Obviously, you would have to do something to really have it stand out because the other maps in the game that we have now are really cluttered. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I know some people have been critics of how cluttered the maps are, especially after the re-release of this game as 1896. But I actually think it's kind of good. Like the visual clutter is actually interesting. It makes the maps feel just more lived in, and that's sort of the aesthetic of Hunt Showdown is having that lived in feel, having that it's run down and abandoned because of the corruption, right? The zombie outbreak or whatever we're calling this thing. I don't know. I'm not somebody who's into Hunt Showdown lore. I'm sorry. I'm never gonna be. If anybody is, don't feel offended. But yeah, I'm sure there are ways to lean into that in a more Southwest style desert-ish map. Again, you wouldn't have to have it fully be desert, but I think that would be really interesting. But that's it. Those are sort of my ideas. Like I said, we're going to be doing a separate video for the wildcard conditions. So look forward to that. And then we've got another video coming out where I'm kind of reviewing the game and reviewing this current event that's going on that allowed DeSalle to come back out. I'm working on that as well, sort of as like a, hey, you know, like the relaunch was a year ago. What do we think about where the game is at right now? And I definitely have some opinions there. So look forward to that as well. But what do you guys think? What do you guys want for some new maps? You guys can let me know down in the comments. And then also too, like, let me know what your favorite map in the game is right now. Do you really like Mammon's Gulch? Do you hate it? Are you glad that DeSalle came back? Are you happy with DeSalle's changes and how it looks? Either way, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.